Hi, friends. We will be getting to a certain scene today, so I decided to get into the spirit of things. No white shirt, but yeah. Hi, Jules. Hi, Julie. I feel like the um, the was it the mirror with the romper room thing? So today we'll be reading chapter 1 through chapter 33. No, chapter 41 through chapter 43. Ah, yes, I can count. So, the first week of their return was soon gone. The second began. It was the last of the regiment's stay in Meryton, and all the young ladies in the neighbourhood were drooping apace. The dejection was almost universal. The elder Miss Bennets alone were still able to eat, drink, and sleep, and pursue the usual course of their employments. Very frequently they were reproached for their insensibility by Kitty and Lydia, whose own misery was extreme, and who could not comprehend such hard-heartedness in any of the family. "Good heavens, what is to become of us? What are we to do?" they would often explain in the bitterness of woe. "How can you be smiling so, Lizzie?" Their affectionate mother shared all the grief, and she remembered what she herself had endured on similar occasion 25 years ago. "I am sure," said she, "I cried for 2 days together when Colonel Miller's regiment went away. I thought I should have broke my heart." "I am sure I shall break mine," said Lydia. "If only one could go to Brighton." "Oh, yes, if I could go to Brighton, but Papa is so disagreeable." "Oh, a little sea bathing would set me up forever." "And my Aunt Phillips is sure it would do me a great deal of good," added Kitty. Such was the kind of lamentations resounding perpetually through Longbourn House. Elizabeth tried to be diverted by them, but all sense of pleasure was lost in shame. She felt anew the justice of Mr. Darcy's objections, and she never had before been so much disposed to pardon his interference in the views of his friend. But the gloom of Lydia's prospect was shortly cleared away, for she received an invitation from Mrs. Forster, the wife of the colonel of the regiment, to accompany her to Brighton. This invaluable friend was a very young woman and very lately married. Their resemblance in good humour and good spirits had recommended her and Lydia to each other, and out of their 3 months' acquaintances they had been intimate for 2. The rapture of Lydia on this occasion, her adoration of Mrs. Forster, the delight of Mrs. Bennet, and the mortification of Kitty are scarce to be described. Wholly inattentive to her sister's feelings, Lydia flew about the house in reckless ecstasy, calling for everyone's congratulations and laughing and talking with more violence than ever, whilst the luckless Kitty continued in the parlour, repining at her fate in terms as unreasonable as her accent was peevish. "I cannot see why Mrs. Forster should not ask me as well as Lydia," she said, for though I am not her particular friend, I have just as much right to be asked as she, and more too, for I am 2 years older." And in vain did Elizabeth attempt to make her reasonable, and Jane to make her resigned. As for Elizabeth herself, this invitation was so far from exciting her the same feelings as in her mother and Lydia, that she considered it as a death warrant of all possibility of common sense for the latter, and detestable as such a step must make her, were it known, she could not help secretly advising her father not to let her go. She represented to him all the improprieties of Lydia's general behaviour, the little advantage she could derive from the friendship of such a woman as Mrs. Forster, and the probability of her being yet more imprudent with such a companion at Brighton, where the temptations must be greater than at home. He heard her attentively, and then said, "Lydia will never be easy till she has exposed herself in some public place or other, and we can never expect her to do it with so little expense or inconvenience to her family as under the present circumstances." If you were aware, said Elizabeth, of the great disadvantage to us all which might arise from the public notice of Lydia's unguarded and imprudent manner, nay, which has already arisen from it, I am sure you would judge differently in the affair. Already arisen, replied Mr. Bennet. What, has she frightened away some of your lovers? Poor little Lizzie! But do not be cast down. Such squeamish youths as cannot bear to be connected with a little absurdity are not worth regret. Come, let me see this list of pitiful fellows who have been kept aloof by Lydia's folly. Indeed, you are mistaken. I have no such injuries to resent. It is not of particular but general evils which I am now complaining. Our importance, our respectability in the world must be affected by the wild volatility, the assurances and disdain of all restraint which mark Lydia's character. Excuse me, for I must speak plainly. If you, my dear father, will not take the trouble of checking her exuberant spirits, and of teaching her that her present pursuits are not to be the business of life, she will soon be beyond reach of amendment. Her character will be fixed, and she will, at 16, be the most determined flirt that ever made herself and her family ridiculous. A flirt, too, in the worst and meaningless degree of flirtation, without any attraction beyond youth and a tolerable person, and from the ignorance and emptiness of her mind, wholly unable to ward off any portion of that universal contempt which her rage for admiration will excite. In this danger Kitty is also comprehended. She will follow wherever Lydia leads, vain, ignorant, idle, and absurd, and absolutely uncontrolled. Oh, my dear father, can you suppose it possible that they will not be censured and despised wherever they are known, and that their sisters will not often be involved in their disgrace? Mr. Bennet saw her whole heart was in the subject, and affectionately taking her hand, said in reply, Do not make yourself uneasy, my love. Wherever you and Jane are known, you must be respected and valued, and you will not appear to less advantage for having a couple of, or I may say 3 very silly sisters. We will have no peace at Longbourn if Lydia does not go to Brighton. Let her go then. Colonel Forster is a sensible man, and will keep her out of any real mischief. And she is lucky to be poor, and to be too poor to be the object of prey to anybody. At Brighton she will be of less importance, even as a common flirt, than she has been here. The officers will find women better worth their notice. Let us hope, therefore, that her being there may teach her her own insignificance. At any rate, she cannot grow many degrees worse, without authorizing us to lock her up for the rest of her life. With this answer, Elizabeth was forced to be content. But her own opinion continued the same, and she left him disappointed and sorry. It was not in her nature, however, to increase her vexations by dwelling on them. She was confident of having performed her duty, and to fret over unavoidable evils or argument them by anxiety was no part of her disposition. Had Lydia and her mother known the substance of her conference with her father, their indignation would hardly have found expression in their united volubility. In Lydia's imagination, a visit to Brighton comprised every possibility of earthly happiness. She saw with the creative eye of fancy the streets, that gay bathing place covered with officers. She saw herself the object of attention to tens and to scores of them at present unknown. She saw all the glories of the camp, its tents stretched forth, its beauteous uniformity of lines, crowded with the young and gay, and dazzling with scarlet, and to complete the view, she saw herself seated beneath a tent, tenderly flirting with at least 6 officers at once. Had she known that her sister ought to tear her from such prospects and such realities as these, what would have been her sensations? They could have been understood only by her mother, who might have felt the same. Lydia's going to Brighton was all that consoled her for the melancholy conviction of her husband's never intending to go there himself. But they were entirely ignorant of what had passed, and their raptures continued with little intermission to the very day of Lydia's leaving home. Elizabeth was now to see Mr. Wickham for the last time. Having been frequently in company with him since his return, agitation was pretty well over, the agitations of former partiality entirely so. She had even learnt to detect, in the very gentleness with which he first delighted her, an affectation and a sameness to disgust and weary. In his present behaviour to herself, moreover, she had a fresh source of displeasure, for the inclination he soon testified of renewing their those attentions which had marked the early part of their acquaintance could only serve, after what had since passed, to provoke her. Yes, Alma. Bright and gay, imagine that. She lost all concern for him in finding herself thus selected as the object of such idle and frivolous gallantry, and while she steadily repressed it, could not but feel the reproof contained in his believing that however long, or for whatever cause, his attentions had been withdrawn, her vanity would be gratified and her preference secured at any time by their renewal. On the very last day of the regiment's remaining at Meryton, he dined with the others of the officers at Longbourn, and so little was Elizabeth disposed to part from him in good humour, that on his making some inquiry as to the manner of her time in which she had passed in Hunsford, she mentioned Colonel Fitzwilliams and Mr. Darcy both having spent 3 weeks at Rosings, and asked him if he was acquainted with the former. He looked surprised, displeased, alarmed, but with a moment's recollection and returning smile, replied that he had formerly seen him often, and after observing that he was a very gentlemanlike man, asked her how she had liked him. Her answer was warmly in his favour, with an air of indifference, he soon afterwards adding, How long did you say he was at Rosings? Nearly 3 weeks. And you saw him frequently? Yes, almost every day. His manners are very different from his cousin's. Yes, different, but I think Mr. Darcy improves on acquaintance. Indeed, cried Wickham, with a look which did not escape her. And pray, may I ask, but checking himself, he added in a gayer tone, is it his address that improves? Has he disdained to add an aught of civility to his ordinary style? For I dare not hope, he continued in low and more serious tone, that he has improved in essentials. Oh, no, said Elizabeth. In essentials, I believe he is very much as he ever was. While she spoke, Wickham looked as if scarcely there. While she spoke, Wickham looked as if scarcely knowing whether to rejoice over her words or distrust their meaning. There was a something in her countenance which made him listen with an apprehensive and anxious attention, while she added, When I said that he improved on acquaintance, I did not mean that either his mind or his manners were in a state of improvement, but that from knowing him better, his disposition was better understood. Wickham's alarm now appeared in a heightened complexion and agitated look. For a few minutes he was silent, till, shaking off his embarrassment, he turned to her again and said, with the gentlest of accents, You who so well know my feelings towards Mr. Darcy will readily comprehend how sincerely I rejoice that he is wise enough to assume even the appearance of what is right. His pride in that direction may be of service, if not to himself, to many others, for it must deter him from such foul misconduct as I have suffered by him. I only fear that the sort of cautiousness to which you, I imagine, have been alluding, is merely adopted on his visits to his aunt, of whose good opinion and judgment he stands in much in awe. His fear of her has always operated, I know, when they were together, and a good deal is to be imputed to his wish of forwarding the match with Miss de Bourgh, which I am certain is very much at heart. Elizabeth could not repress a smile at this, but she answered only by a slight inclination of the head. She saw that he wanted to engage her on the old subject of his grievances, and she was in no humour to indulge him. The rest of the evening passed with the appearance, on his side, of usual cheerfulness, with no farther attempts to distinguish Elizabeth, and they parted at last with a mutual civility and possibly a mutual desire of never meeting again. When the party broke up, Lydia returned with Mrs. Forster to Meryton, from whence they were to set out early the next morning. The separation between her and her family was rather noisy than pathetic. Kitty was the only one who shed tears, but she did weep from vexation and envy. Mrs. Bennet was diffuse in her good wishes for the felicity of her daughter, and impressive in her injunctions that she would not miss an opportunity of enjoying herself as much as possible, advice which there was every reason to believe would be attended to. And in a clamorous happiness of Lydia herself, in bidding farewell, the most gentle of adieus to her sisters were uttered without being heard. Chapter 42. Had Elizabeth's opinions been all drawn from her own family, she could not have formed a very pleasing picture of conjugal felicity or domestic comfort. Her father, captivated by youth and beauty, and the appearance of good humour which youth and beauty generally give, he married a woman whose weak understanding and illiberal mind he had very early in their marriage put an end to any real affection for her. Respect, esteem, and confidence had vanished forever, and all his views of domestic happiness were overthrown. But Mr. Bennet was not in the disposition to seek comfort from the disappointment which his own imprudence had brought on, and in all of those pleasures which too often console the unfortunate for their folly and their vice. He was fond of the country and of books, and from these tastes had arisen his principal enjoyment. To his wife he was very little otherwise indebted than as her ignorance and folly had contributed to his amusement. This is not the sort of happiness which a man would in general wish to owe to his wife, but where other powers of entertainment aren't wanting, the true philosopher will derive benefit from such as are given. Elizabeth, however, had never been blind to the impropriety of her father's behaviour as a husband. She had always seen it with pain, but respecting his abilities and grateful for his affectionate treatment of herself, she endeavoured to forget what she could not overlook, and to banish from her thoughts that continual breach of conjugal obligation and decorum, which, in exposing his wife to the contempt of her own children, was so highly reprehensible. But she had never felt so strongly as now the disadvantages which must attend the children of so unsuitable a marriage, nor ever been so fully aware of the evils arising from so ill-judged a direction of talents which rightly used might at least have preserved the respectability of his daughters, even if incapable of enlarging the mind of his wife. When Elizabeth had rejoiced over Wickham's departure, she found little other cause for satisfaction in the loss of the regiment. Their parties abroad were less varied than before, and at home she had a mother and a sister whose constant repining at the dullness of everything around them threw a real gloom over their domestic circle. And though Kitty might in time regain her natural degree of sense, since the disturbers of her brain were removed, her other sister, from whose disposition greater evil might be apprehended, was likely to be hardened in all her folly and assurances by the situation of such double danger as a watering place and a camp. Upon the whole, therefore, she found what she had been sometimes found before, that an event to which she had looked forward with impatient desire did not, in taking place, bring all the satisfaction she had promised herself. It was consequently necessary to name some other period for the commencement of actual felicity, to have some other point on which her wishes and hopes might be fixed, and by again enjoying the pleasure of anticipation, console herself for the present, and prepare for another disappointment. Her tours to the lake was now the object of her happiest thoughts. It was her best consolation for all the uncomfortable hours which the discontentedness of her mother and Kitty made inevitable, and could she have included Jane in the scheme, every part of it would have been perfect. But it is fortunate, thought she, that I have something to wish for. Were the whole arrangement complete, my disappointment would be certain. But here, by carrying with me one ceaseless source of regret in my sister's absence, I may reasonably hope to have all of my expectations of pleasure released. A scheme of which every part promises delight can never be successful, and great general disappointment is only warded off by the deference of some little particular vexation. When Lydia went away, she promised to write often and very minutely to her mother and Kitty, but her letters were always long expected and always very short. Those to her mother contained little else than that they were returned from the library where such and such officers had attended them, and where she had seen such beautiful ornaments as made her quite wild, that she had a new gown or a new parasol, which she would have described more fully, but was obliged to leave off in a violent hurry, as Mrs. Forrester called her, and they were going to the camp. And from her correspondence with her sister there was less to be learned, for her letters to Kitty, though rather longer, were much too full of lines under the words to be made public. After the first fortnight or 3 weeks of her absence, health, good humour, and cheerfulness began to reappear at Longbourn. Everything wore a happier aspect. The families who had been in town for the winter came back again, and summer finery and summer engagements arose. Mrs. Bennet was restored to her usual querulous serenity, and by the middle of June, Kitty was so much recovered as to be able to enter Meryton without tears. An event of such happy promise as to make Elizabeth hope that by the following Christmas she might be so tolerably reasonable as to not mention an officer above once a day, unless some cruel and malicious arrangement in the War Office, another regiment should be quartered at Meryton. The time fixed for the beginning of their northern tour was now fast approaching, and a fortnight only was wanting of it, when a letter arrived from Mrs. Gardiner, which at once delayed its commencement and curtailed its extent. Mr. Gardiner would be prevented by business from setting off till a fortnight later in July, and must be in London again within a month, and as that left too short a period for them to go so far, and see so much as they had promised, or at least to see it without the leisure and comfort they had built on, they were obliged to give up the lakes and substitute a more contracted tour, and according to their present plan would go no farther northward than Derbyshire. In that country there was enough to be seen to occupy chief of their 3 weeks, and to Mrs. Gardiner it had particularly strong attraction, the town where she had formerly passed some years of her life, and where they were now to spend a few days, and was probably an object of her curiosity, as all the celebrated beauties of Matlock, Chatsworth, Dovedale, or the Peaks. Elizabeth was excessively disappointed. She had set her heart on seeing the lakes, and still thought there might have been time enough, but it was her business to be satisfied, and certainly her temper to be happy, and all was soon right again. With the mention of Derbyshire, there were many ideas connected. It was impossible for her to see the word without thinking of Pemberley and its owner. "But surely," she said, "I may enter his county with impunity, and rob it of a few petrified spars, without him perceiving me." The period of expectation was now doubled. 4 weeks were to pass away before her uncle and aunt's arrival, but they did pass away, and Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, with their 4 children, did at length appear at Longbourn. The children, 2 girls of 6 and 8 years old, and 2 younger boys, were to be left under the particular care of their cousin Jane, who was the general favourite, and whose steady sense and sweetness of temper exactly adapted her for attending to them in every way, teaching them, playing with them, and loving them. The Gardiners stayed only 1 night at Longbourn, and set off the next morning with Elizabeth in pursuit of novelty and amusement. One enjoyment was certain, that of the suitableness as companions, a suitableness which comprehended health and temper to bear inconveniences, cheerfulness to enhance every pleasure, and affection and intelligence which might supply it among themselves if there were disappointments abroad. It is not the object of this work to give a description of Derbyshire, nor of any of the remarkable places through which their route thither lay. Oxford, Blenheim, Warwick, Kenilworth, Birmingham, etc. are sufficiently known. A small part of Derbyshire is the present concern, to the town of Lambton, the scene of Mrs. Gardiner's former residence, and where she had lately learned that some acquaintances still remained. They bent their steps after having seen all the principal wonders of the county. And within 5 miles of Lambton, Elizabeth found from her aunt that Pemberley was situated. It was not in their direct route, nor was it a mile or 2 out of it. In talking over their route that evening before, Mrs. Gardiner expressed an inclination to see the place again. Mr. Gardiner declared his willingness, and Elizabeth was applied to for her approbation. "My love, should not you like to see the place of which you have heard so much?" said her aunt. "A place, too, which so many of your acquaintances are connected. Wickham passed all his youth there, you know." Elizabeth was distressed. She felt that she had no business at Pemberley, and was obliged to assume a disinclination for seeing it. She must own that she was tired of great houses, but after going over so many, she really had no pleasure in fine carpets or satin curtains. Mrs. Gardiner abused her stupidity. If it were merely a fine house richly furnished," said she, "I should not care about it myself, but the grounds are delightful. They have some of the finest woods in the county." Elizabeth said no more, but her mind could not acquiesce. The possibility of meeting Mr. Darcy while viewing the place instantly occurred. It would be dreadful. She blushed at the very idea, and thought it would be better to speak openly to her aunt than run such a risk. But against this there were objections. She had finally resolved that it could be the last resource, if her private inquiries as to the absence of the family were unfavourably answered. Accordingly, when she retired at night, she asked the chambermaid whether Pemberley was not a very fine place, and what the name of its proprietor, and with no little alarm, whether the family were down for the summer. A most welcome negative followed the last question, and her alarms now being removed, she was at leisure to feel a great deal of curiosity as to see the house herself, and when the subject was revived the next morning, and she was again applied to, could readily answer, and with a proper air of indifference, that she had not really any dislike to the scheme. To Pemberley, therefore, they would go. I didn't put on a white shirt. I wasn't going that far. But I wet my hair for this scene anyway. Chapter 43. Elizabeth, as they drove along, watched for the first appearance of Pemberley Woods with some perturbation, and when at length they turned at the lodge, her spirits were in a high flutter. The park was very large and contained great variety of ground. They entered it at one of its lowest points and drove for some time through a beautiful wood stretching out over a wide extent. Elizabeth's mind was too full for conversation, but she saw and admired every remarkable spot and point of view. They generally ascended for half a mile and found themselves at the top of a considerable eminence, where the wood ceased, and the eye was instantly caught by Pemberley House, situated on the opposite side of the valley, into which the road with some abruptness wound. It was a large, handsome stone building, standing well on rising ground, and backed by a ridge of high woody hills, and in front a stream of some natural importance which was swelled into greater, but without any artificial appearance. Its banks were neither formal nor falsely adorned. Elizabeth was delighted. She had never seen a place for which nature had done more, or where natural beauty had been so little counteracted by an awkward taste. They were all of them warm in their admiration, and at that moment she felt that to be a mistress of Pemberley might be something. They descended the hill, crossed the bridge, and drove to the door, and while examining the nearer aspect of the house, all her apprehensions of meeting its owner returned. She dreaded lest the chambermaid had been mistaken. On applying to see the place, they were admitted into the hall, and Elizabeth, as they waited for the housekeeper, had leisure to wonder at her being where she was. The housekeeper came, a respectable-looking elderly woman, much less fine and more civil than she had any notion of finding her. They followed her into the dining parlour. It was a large, well-proportioned room, handsomely fitted up. Elizabeth, after slightly surveying it, went to the window to enjoy its prospect. The hill, crowned with wood, from which they had descended, received an increasing abruptness from the distance, was a beautiful object. Every disposition of the ground was good, and she looked on the whole scene, the river, the trees scattered on the banks, and the winding of the valley, as far as she could trace it, with delight. As they passed into other rooms, these objects were taken in different positions, but from every window there were beauties to be seen. The rooms were lofty and handsome, and their furniture suitable to the fortune of their proprietor. But Elizabeth saw, with admiration of his taste, that it was neither gaudy nor uselessly fine, and with less of splendour and more real elegance than the furniture of Rosings. And if this place, she thought, I might have been mistress. With these rooms I might have been familiarly acquainted, instead of viewing them as a stranger. I might have rejoiced in them as my own, welcomed to them visitors as my uncle and aunt. But no, she recollected herself, that could never be. My uncle and aunt would have been lost to me. I should not have been allowed to invite them. This was a lucky recollection. It saved her from something like regret. She longed to inquire of the housekeeper whether her master was really absent, but had not the courage for it. At length, however, the question was asked by her uncle, and turned away with alarm, while Mrs. Reynolds replied that he was adding, "But we expect him tomorrow with a large party of friends." Well, that was a terrible accent. How rejoiced was Elizabeth that their journey had not been by any circumstances delayed by a day. Her aunt now called her to look at the picture. As she approached and saw the likeness of Mr. Wickham suspended among several other miniatures over the mantelpiece. Her aunt asked her smilingly how she liked it. The housekeeper came forward and told her it was a picture of a young gentleman, the son of her late Master Stuart, who had been brought up with him at his own expense. "He has gone into the army now," she added, "but I am afraid he has turned out rather wild." Mrs. Gardiner looked at her niece with a smile, but Elizabeth could not return it. "And that," said Mrs. Reynolds, pointing to another picture, "is my master, and very like him. It was drawn at the same time as the other, about 8 years ago." "I have heard much of your master's fine person," said Mrs. Gardiner, looking at the picture. "Is it not? It is a handsome face, but Lizzie, you can tell us whether it is alike or not." Mrs. Reynolds' respect for Elizabeth seemed to increase on the intimation of her knowing her master. "Does this young lady know Mr. Darcy?" Elizabeth coloured and said, "A little." "And do you not think him a very handsome gentleman, ma'am?" "Yes, very handsome." "I am sure I know none so handsome, but in the gallery upstairs you will find a larger, finer picture of him than this. This room was my late master's favourite room, and these miniatures are just as they used to be by then. He was fond of them." This accounted to Elizabeth for Mr. Wickham's being among them. Mrs. Reynolds then directed their attention to one of Miss Darcy, drawn when she was only 8 years old. "And is Miss Darcy as handsome as her brother?" said Mrs. Gardiner. "Oh, yes, the handsomest young lady that ever was seen, and so accomplished. She plays and sings all day long. In the next room is a new instrument just come down for her, a present from my master. She comes here tomorrow with him." Mr. Gardiner, whose manners were easy and pleasant, encouraged her communicativeness by his questions and remarks. Mrs. Reynolds, either from pride or attachment, and evidently a great pleasure in talking of her master and his sister. "Is your master much at Pemberley in the course of the year?" "Not so much as I would wish, sir, but I dare say he may spend half his time here, and Miss Darcy is always down for the summer months." "Except," thought Elizabeth, "when she goes to Ramsgate." "If your master would marry, you might see more of him." "Yes, sir, but I do not know when that will be. I do not know who is good enough for him." Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner smiled. Elizabeth could not help saying, "It is very much to his credit, I'm sure, that you should think so." "I say no more than the truth, and what everybody will say that knows him," replied the other. Elizabeth thought this was going pretty far, and listened with increasing astonishment as the housekeeper added, "I have never had a cross word from him in my life, and I have known him since he was 4 years old." This was praise of all others most extraordinary, most opposite to her ideas. That he was not a good-tempered man had been her firmest opinion. Her keenest attention was awakened. She longed to hear more, and was grateful to her uncle for saying, "There are very few people of whom so much can be said. You are lucky to have such a master." "Yes, sir, I know I am, and if I was to go through the world I could meet none better. But I have always observed that they who are good-natured when children are good-natured when they grow up, and he was always the sweetest-tempered, most generous-hearted boy in the world." Elizabeth almost stared at her. "Can this be Mr. Darcy?" she thought. "His father was an excellent man," said Mrs. Gardiner. "Yes, ma'am, he was indeed, and his son will be just like him, just as affable to the poor." Elizabeth listened, wondered, doubted, and was impatient for more. Mrs. Reynolds could interest her only on one other point. She related the subject of the picture, the very dimensions of the rooms, and the price of the furniture in vain. Mr. Gardiner, highly amused by the kind of family prejudice to which he attributed her excessive commendation of her master, soon led again to the subject, and she dwelt with energy on his many merits as they proceeded together up the great staircase. "He is the best landlord and the best master," said she, "that ever lived. not like the wild young men nowadays who think nothing but themselves. There is not one of his tenants nor servants but would give him a good name. Some people fancy him proud, but I have never saw anything of it. To my fancy, it is only because he doesn't rattle away like other young men. In what an amiable light does this place him, thought Elizabeth. This is a fine account of him, whispered her aunt, and they walked. It's not consistent with the behaviour to our poor friend. Possibly we might have been deceived? That is not very likely. Her authority was too good. On reaching the spacious lobby above, they were shown into a very pretty sitting room, lately fitted up with great elegance and lightness than the apartments before, and were informed that it was just done to give pleasure to Miss Darcy, who had taken a liking to the room when last at Pemberley. He is certainly a good brother, said Elizabeth as she walked towards one of the windows. Mrs. Reynolds anticipated Miss Darcy's delight when she would enter the room, and this is always the way with him, she added. Whatever can give his sister any pleasure is sure to be done in a moment. There is nothing he would not do for her. The picture gallery and 2 or 3 of the principal bedrooms were all that remained to be shown. In the former were many good paintings, but Elizabeth knew nothing of the art, and from such had been already visible below, she had willingly turned to look at some drawings of Miss Darcy's in crayon, whose subjects were usually more interesting and also more intelligible. In the gallery there were many family portraits, but they could have little to fix the attention of a stranger. Elizabeth walked on in quest to find the only face whose features would be known to her. At length it arrested her, and she beheld a striking resemblance of Mr. Darcy, with such a smile over his face, as she remembered him to have sometimes seen when he looked at her. She stood several minutes before the picture in earnest contemplation, and returned to it again before quitting the gallery. Mrs. Reynolds informed them that it had been taken in his father's lifetime. There was certainly at this moment in Elizabeth's mind a more gentle sensation towards the original than she had ever felt at the height of their acquaintance. The commendation bestowed on him by Mrs. Reynolds was of no trifling nature. What praise is more valuable than the praise of an intelligent servant? As a brother, a landlord, a master, she considered how many people's happiness were in his guardianship, how much of pleasure or pain it was his to bestow, how much of good or evil must be done by him. The idea that had been brought forward by the housekeeper was favourable to his character, and as she stood before the canvas on which he was represented and fixed his eyes upon herself, she thought of his regard with a deeper sentiment of gratitude than it had ever raised before. She remembered its warmth and softened at its impropriety of expression. When all of the house was open to the general inspection they had been seen, they returned downstairs, and taking leave of the housekeeper, were consigned over to the gardener, who met them at the hall door. As they walked across the lawn towards the river, Elizabeth turned back to look again. Her uncle and aunt stopped also, and while the former was conjecturing as to the date of the building, the owner of it himself suddenly came forward from the road, which led behind it to the stables. And like as pictured in the film, he wasn't actually in a wet shirt. They were within 20 yards of each other, and so abrupt was his appearance that it was impossible to avoid his sight. Their eyes instantly met, and the cheeks of each were overspread with the deepest blush. He absolutely started, and for a moment seemed immovable from surprise. But shortly recovering himself, advanced towards the party and spoke to Elizabeth, if not in terms of perfect composure, at least of perfect civility. She had instinctively turned away, but stopping on his approach, received his compliments with an embarrassment impossible to overcome. Had his first appearance, or his resemblance to the picture they had just been examining, been insufficient to assure the other two that they now saw Mr. Darcy, the gardener's expression of surprise on beholding his master must immediately have told it. They stood a little aloof while he was talking to their niece, who, astonished and confused, scarcely dared to lift her eyes to his face, and knew not what an answer she returned to his civil inquiries after her family. Amazed at the At the alteration in his manner since they last parted, every sentence that he uttered was increasing her embarrassment, and every idea of impropriety of her being found there recurring to her mind. A few minutes in which they continued together were some of the most uncomfortable of her life. Nor did he seem much more at ease. When he spoke, his accent had none of its usual sedateness, and he repeated his inquiries at the time of her having left Longbourn, and of her stay in Derbyshire, as so often and in so hurried a way as he plainly spoke of the distraction of his thoughts. At length every idea seemed to fail him, and after standing a few moments without saying a word, he suddenly recollected himself and took leave. The others then joined him and expressed their admiration of his figure, but Elizabeth heard not a word, and was wholly engrossed by her own feelings, followed them in silence. She was overpowered by shame and vexation. Her coming there was the most unfortunate, most ill-judged thing in the world. How strange must it appear to him! In what a disgraceful light might it not strike so vain a man! It might seem as if she had purposely thrown herself in his way again. Oh, why did she come? Oh, why did he thus come a day before he was expected? Had they been only 10 minutes sooner, they should have been beyond the reach of his discrimination, for it was plain that he was that moment arrived, that moment alighted from his horse or carriage. She blushed again and again over the perverseness of their meeting, and of his behaviour so strikingly altered. What could it mean? That he should even speak to her was amazing, but to speak with such civility, to inquire after her family, never in her life had she seen his manners so little dignified, never had he spoken with such gentleness as on this unexpected meeting. What a contrast did it offer to his last address in Rosings Park, when he put the letter into her hand, she knew not what to think, nor how to account for it. They had now entered a beautiful walk by the side of the water, and every step was bringing forward a nobler fall of the ground, or a finer reach of the woods to which they were approaching. But it was some time before Elizabeth was sensible of any of it, and though she had answered mechanically to the repeated appeals of her uncle and aunt, it seemed to direct her eyes to such objects as they pointed out. She distinguished no part of the scene. Her thoughts were all fixed on that one spot of Pemberley House, whichever it might be, where Darcy then was. She longed to know what at that moment was passing in his mind, in what manner he thought of her, and whether, in defiance of everything, she was still dear to him. Perhaps he had been civil, only because he felt himself at ease, yet there had been that in his voice which was not like ease. Whether he had felt more of pain or pleasure in seeing her, she could not tell, but he certainly had not seen her with composure. At length, however, the remarks of her companions on her absence of mind roused her, and she felt the necessity of appearing more like herself. They entered the woods, and bidding adieu to the river for a while, ascended some of the higher ground, whence, in spots where the opening of the trees gave the eye power to wonder, were many charming views of the valley, the opposite hills, with the long strained range of woods overspreading many and occasionally part of the stream. Mr. Gardiner expressed a wish of going round the whole park, but feared it might be beyond a walk. With a triumphant smile, they were told that it was 10 miles round. It settled the matter, and they pursued the accustomed circuit, which brought them again, after some time, in the descent among hanging woods, to the very edge of the water, in one of the narrowest parts. They crossed it by a simple bridge. In character with the gentle air of the scene, it was a spot less adorned than any of they had yet visited, and the valley, which had contracted into a glen, allowed room only for the stream, and a narrow walk amidst the rough coppice woods which had bordered it. Elizabeth longed to explore its windings, but they had crossed the bridge, and perceived their distance from the house. Mrs. Gardiner, who was not a great walker, could go no further, and thought only of returning to the carriage as quickly as possible. Her niece was therefore obliged to submit, and they took their way towards the house on the opposite side of the river, in the nearest direction. But their progress was slow, for Mr. Gardiner, though seldom able to indulge the taste, was very fond of fishing, and was very much engaged in watching the occasional appearance of some trout in the water, and talking to the man about them, and then that he advanced but little. Whilst wandering in this slow manner, they were again surprised, and Elizabeth's astonishment was quite equal to what was quite equal to what had been at first the sight of Mr. Darcy approaching them, and at no great distance. The walk being here less sheltered than on the other side, allowed them to see him before they met. Elizabeth, however astonished, was at least more prepared for an interview than before, and resolved to appear and to speak with calmness, if he really intended to meet them. But for a few moments, indeed, she felt he would probably strike into some other path. The idea lasted while a turning in the walk concealed him from their view. The turning past, he was immediately before them. With a glance she saw that he had lost none of his recent civility, and to imitate his politeness she began, as they met, to admire the beauty of the place. But she had not gone beyond the words delightful and charming, when some unlucky recollection obtruded, and she fancied that praise of Pemberley from her might be mischievously constructed. Her colour changed, and she said no more. Mrs. Gardiner was standing a little behind them, and on her pausing he asked her if she would do him the honour of introducing him to her friends. This was a stroke of civility for which she was quite unprepared, and she could hardly suppress a smile at his being now seeking the acquaintance of some of those very people against whom his pride had revolted in his offer to herself. What will be his surprise, thought she, when he knows who they are? He takes them now for people of fashion. The introduction, however, was immediately made, and as she named the relationship to herself, she stole a sly look at him, to see how he bore it, and was not without expectation of his decamping as fast as he could from such disgraceful companions. That he was surprised by the connection was evident, that he sustained it with fortitude, and, so far from going away, turned back with them, and entered into conversation with Mr. Gardiner. Elizabeth could not but be pleased, but could not but triumph. It was consoling that he should know that she had some relations from whom there was no need to blush. She listened more attentively to all that passed between them, and gloried in every expression, every sentence of her uncle, which marked his intelligence, his taste, or his good manners. The conversation turned upon fishing, and she heard Mr. Darcy invite him, with the greatest civility, to fish there as often as he chose, while he continued in the neighbourhood, offering at the same time to supply him with fishing tackle, and pointing out those parts of the stream where there was usually most sport. Mrs. Gardiner, who was walking arm in arm with Elizabeth, gave a look of expressive of her wonder. Elizabeth said nothing, but it gratified her exceedingly to compliment. The compliment must be all for herself. Her astonishment, however, was extreme, and so continual that she was repeating, "Why is he so altered? From what can it proceed? It cannot be for me. It cannot be for my sake that his manners are thus softened. My reproofs at Hunsford could not work such change as this. It is impossible that he should still love me." After walking some time, the two ladies in front, the two gentlemen behind, on resuming their place, after descending to the brink of the river for a better inspection of some curious water plant, there chanced to be a little alteration. It originated in Mrs. Gardiner, who, fatigued from the exercise of the morning, found Elizabeth's arm inadequate to her support, and consequently preferred her husband's. Mr. Darcy took her place by her niece, and they walked on together. After a short silence, the lady spoke first. She wished him to know that she had been assured of his absence before she came to the place, and accordingly began by observing that his arrival had been very unexpected. "For your housekeeper," she added, "informed us that you would be certainly not here till tomorrow, and indeed, before we left Bakewell, we understood you were not immediately expected in the country." He acknowledged the truth of it, and said that business with his steward had occasioned his coming forward a few hours before the rest of the party with whom he had been travelling. "They will join me tomorrow," he continued, "and among them are some who will claim an acquaintance with you, Mr. Bingley and his sisters." Elizabeth answered only a slight bow, and her thoughts were driven back to the time when Mr. Bingley's name had been last mentioned between them, and if she might judge from his complexion, his mind was not very differently engaged. "There is also one other person in the party," he continued after a pause, who particular wishes to be known to you. Will you allow me, or do I ask too much, to introduce my sister to you, during your to your acquaintance during your stay at Lambton. The surprise of such application was great indeed. It was too great for her to know in what manner she acceded to it. She immediately felt that whatever desires Miss Darcy might have for being acquainted with her must be the work of her brother. And without looking farther, it was satisfactory. It was gratifying to know that his resentment had not made him think really ill of her. They now walked on in silence, each of them deep in thought. Elizabeth was not comfortable. It was impossible, but she was flattered and pleased. His wish of introducing his sister to her was a compliment of the highest kind. They soon outstripped the others, and when they reached the carriage, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner were half a quarter of a mile behind. He then asked her to walk into the house, but she declared herself not tired as they stood together on the lawn. At such a time much might have been said, and silence was very awkward. She wanted to talk, but there seemed an embargo on every subject. At last she recollected that she had been travelling, and talked of Matlock and Dovedale with great perseverance. Yet time and her aunt moved slowly, and her patience and her ideas were nearly worn out before the tete-a-tete was over. On Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner's coming up, they were all pressed to go into the house and take some refreshments, but this was declined, and they parted on each side with the utmost politeness. Mr. Darcy handed the ladies into the carriage when it drove off, and Elizabeth saw him walking slowly towards the house. The observation of her uncle and aunt now began, and each of them pronounced him to be infinitely superior to anything they had expected. "He is perfectly well behaved, polite and unassuming," said her uncle. "There is something stately in him, to be sure," replied her aunt, "but it is confined to his air and not unbecoming. I can now say with the housekeeper that I thought some people call him proud. I have seen nothing of it." "I was never more surprised than by his behaviour to us. It was more than civil, it was really attentive. And there was no necessity for such attention. His acquaintance with Elizabeth was very trifling." "To be sure, Lizzie," said her aunt, "he is not so handsome as Wickham, or rather he is not Wickham's countenance, for his features are perfectly good. But how came you to tell us that he was so disagreeable?" Elizabeth excused herself as well as she could, that she had liked him better when they had met at Kent than before, and that she had never seen him so pleasant as this morning. Perhaps he may be a little whimsical in his civilities," replied her uncle. "Your great men often are, and therefore I shall not take him at his word about fishing, as he might change his mind another day and warn me off the grounds." Elizabeth felt that they had been entirely mistaken his character, but said nothing. "From what we have seen of him," continued Mrs. Gardiner, "I really should not have thought that he could have behaved so cruel a way to anybody as he has done by poor Wickham. He has not an ill-natured look. On the contrary, there was something pleasing about his mouth when he speaks, and there is something of dignity in his countenance that would not give an unfavourable idea of his heart. But to be sure, the good lady who showed us around the house did give him a most flaming character. I could hardly help laughing aloud sometimes. But he is a liberal master, I suppose, and that, in the eye of a servant, comprehends every virtue." Elizabeth here felt herself called on to say something in vindication of his behaviour to Wickham, and therefore gave them to understand in as guarded manner as possible that by what she had heard from his relations in Kent, his actions were capable of a very different construction, and that his character was not by no means so faulty, nor Wickham so admirable, as they had been considered in Hertfordshire. In confirmation of this, she related the particulars of the pecuniary transaction in which they had been connected, without actually naming her authority, but stating that it was such as to be relied upon. Mrs. Gardiner was surprised and concerned, but they were now approaching the scene of her former pleasures. Every idea gave way to the charm of recollection, and she was too much to engage in pointing out to her husband all the interesting spots in its environments, to think of anything else. Fatigued as she had been by the morning's walk, they had no sooner dined than she set off again in quest of her former acquaintance, and the evening was spent in the satisfaction of an intercourse renewed after many years' discontinuance. The occurrences of the day were too full of interest to leave Elizabeth much attention to any of these new friends, and she could do nothing but think, and think with wonder, of Mr. Darcy's civility, and above all, of his wishing her to be acquainted with his sister. That's it for today. Yes, the lake dump jumping bit is was added for the movie. He doesn't actually jump in a pond. She's not actually possessed by Victorian shame, Alma, because Queen Victoria actually is either not born or an infant at this stage. The Victorian era doesn't start till 1813, and this is about 1815 at most, I think. Less than that. It's before Waterloo. So yes, we're firmly in the Regency, which is Georgian. Yes, that is me being very pedantic, but there we go. I was actually placing it in its time zone, but yes, definitely, very feeling a lot of shamey feelings there from all the silly upper class British aristocracy nonsense. Yeah, so there we are. That's it for this week. I'll be back on Monday with introducing Georgiana Darcy, and then we'll go on from there. So it's been fun, folks. I hope you have a great weekend, and yeah, don't go visiting any great men's houses when you're thinking you might meet them. I don't know, maybe do. Okay. Bye now.